คุณผู้ชมคะเรื่องของความมั่นคงทางอาหารเป็นประเด็นที่ทั่วโลกกำลังให้ความสำคัญสำหรับประเทศไทยเองผู้คนอาจจะมีความรู้สึกว่าประเทศไทยมีความอุดมสมบูรณ์ไม่ต้องกังวลเรื่องของความมั่นคงทางอาหารแต่ในความเป็นจริงอาจจะต้องคิดใหม่นะคะโดยเฉพาะในยุคที่เรากำลังเดินหน้าเข้าสู่ความเป็นประชาคมอาเซียนนโยบายในเรื่องของอาหารอาจจะต้องปรับเปลี่ยนเพื่อเพิ่มศักยภาพสำหรับประเทศค่ะคืนนี้ดิฉันจะคุยกับศาสตราจารย์ปีเตอร์ทิมเมอร์จากมหาวิทยาลัยฮาร์วาร์ดผู้เชี่ยวชาญด้านอาหารและนโยบายด้านอาหารค่ะ Professor Peter Timmer, thank you for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me.
You have been here as in the capacity of food expert and you have done this for more than 40 years. What's the main message you bring to Thailand this time?
Well, my keynote address at the conference that the Royal Society sponsored was that we have to think about these food problems in a long-run historical perspective. And so I focused on the major changes that we've seen in the world food system over the last 40 years or so, and then thought a bit about the nature of the problems we were going to be facing going forward. But my main task was basically to set the framework for the conference and get a baseline. Everybody could understand, here's where we came from, here's where we are, then my ideas about where we might go, but that's what the conference was talking about.
And what are the biggest change in the past 40 years?
Oh, I think the biggest change in terms of what I find surprising. I started working in this field almost 50 years ago, but 40 years ago I taught my very first course on the world food economy. And so I asked, well, what has changed in the 40 years since I first taught a course on this topic? And I think the biggest change is the rapid economic growth and reduction in poverty in East and Southeast Asia. It has been revolutionary. I started my career in Indonesia in 1970, working in the National Planning Agency for the Harvard Advisory Team, and we did not think it would be possible for per capita incomes to grow more than 2 or maybe by 3% a year if we were lucky. 40 years later, we look back and they've grown by 6% per year. It's just an astonishing acceleration in poverty reduction and how fast people have been brought up out of poverty. How many people, hundreds of millions of people in this region have been brought up out of poverty into a middle class.
The priority you see is economic growth in the world. And does it correlate with being food exporters, especially for Southeast Asia?
There's no real correlation. If you're lucky enough to have the resource base that allows you to be a food exporter, Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia is probably going to be a net exporter as well. I think that gives you opportunities in terms of food security that the net importers like the Philippines or Malaysia or Indonesia do not have. On the other hand, Indonesia has grown as fast as anybody in the region as a food importer. I think the question is how you manage the trade relationship. I am very concerned about a withdrawal, country by country, a withdrawal from international trade, trying to be self-sufficient, trying to do their food security on the basis of just their own production. Well, that's bad news.
Is that not the right path?
I think what we have to do is make sure that we have reasonably efficient production, utilizing our natural resources effectively, and then use trade to do the things we can't do well. And Indonesia ought to be producing 80 or maybe even 90% of its rice, but it should not be producing 100%, because the difference in cost for that last 10%, it's $400 versus $800. Why would the poor in Indonesia want $800 rice when they could have it for $400?
So what kind of food intervention program that each country in Southeast Asia should initiate?
That's the key question, and it's a different answer for each question because their resource base is different. Their histories are different, their cultures are different. So you have to do this country by country. But having said that, there has been a huge payoff to research in agriculture, just developing modern seed varieties, investment in irrigation, water control, investment in rural infrastructure and education, public health. the human capital in the rural environment. The countries that have invested in their rural economies, that doesn't say, oh, self-sufficient in rice. Maybe they're investing in livestock production, in aquaculture, in fruits and vegetables. There's lots of different things that can grow on the farm. You want to do that as efficiently as you can, but all of these countries need to be investing very significantly in their agriculture. We saw a picture today from Jikun Huang in China. China is increasing its agricultural investments 20% per year, and it's already spending more per hectare on agriculture than the United States. There's no other country in the region that even comes close to that. So China's going to leave us behind if we're not careful.
For Thailand still celebrates, still very happy with the position of being the world top rice exporter.
Well, you're getting
Thailand
back
be
to do
happy
that.
about it.
Well, you're getting.
What's the position
you
that
shot
Thailand
yourself
should
in the
achieve
foot. You know, the paddy procurement scheme did not help your position in the world market. You build up some very large stocks. But Thailand is clearly one of the 2 or 3 most efficient producers of rice in the world, and that's at the farm level. You clearly have the most efficient marketing and processing, trading facilities in the world. Anywhere you do that better than anybody else. That is a huge comparative advantage for Thailand. But understand, rice is not that important in Thailand any longer. It's important to the people in terms of production. Your consumption is declining. It's a nice export earner for you. But you're going through a structural transformation here where the urban economy, where the non-farm rural economy is actually becoming much, much more important than that rice sector. Now, the rice sector is important. The rest of the world really needs Thailand to keep investing in its rice and its rice exports. But Thailand has to start thinking about its future where rice is not the main driver of the rural economy.
Any recommendation for Thailand
Well,
in
fruits
particular?
and vegetables, livestock, all the things that are aquaculture, all the things that people in a growing middle class want to eat. As they stop eating rice, they reduce that. Rice consumption is going down all through Asia. But what's going up? Consumption of fish, eggs, poultry, meat, dairy, all of those are going up. Fruits and vegetables. If we're going to have healthy diets, if we're going to have nutritionally appropriate diets, we're going to have to eat more fruits and vegetables, maybe not so much meat per se, but good high quality animal protein. Rice is a fine accompaniment to that, but the real income for farmers is going to come from feeding the middle class that diversified diet that they want.
Does your argument mean you are very supportive of industrial farming, massive production?
No, actually no, not industrial farming. What I'm in support of are what I think we should still be calling small farms, but commercially viable. In Thailand, that would mean 10 to 15 hectares. Not like in the United States. I grew up on a farm, and by the time I left and gave it over to my 2 brothers to farm, we had, in hectares, we had 800 hectares on our farm. And we were not considered a very big farm. We had 20 tractors and 3 workers. So that's not what you want in this part of the world. It's not efficient. The things that we need farmers to be producing, the fruits, vegetables, livestock, aquaculture, these are very management intensive. You need a lot of skill to do that. And you can't apply that management to great big farms. You have to do it on smaller farms. So I would have thought we need to get up to commercial size farms, but we don't want big industrial farms. Those are typically not very efficient. Again, Jikun Huang in his story on China showed that China's already starting to develop some of these large-scale industrial farms, and they have higher costs and lower yields than the farms that are between 7 and 15 hectares. That's almost certainly the optimum for this part of the world.
Currently in Thailand, there is debate on how should farmers or agricultural sector in Thailand concentrate on GMO.
Big controversy. I mean, in the United States, we've had a lot of GMO products in our food system now for 20 years. There's, as far as I can tell, not a single person has been harmed by consuming GMOs. I do understand the political and cultural objections to that, but I think the science is quite clear. GMOs offer a real opportunity to solve some problems that we cannot solve by traditional breeding. Think about a virus infection of cassava. Well, that's actually important in Thailand. You can't do breeding on cassava because cassava is grown clonally. If you're going to find resistance to this virus, you're almost certainly going to have to do it through GMO technology. Now, are there safety concerns? I don't see any. One of my colleagues, Hans Binswanger, who works especially on agriculture in sub-Saharan Africa, points out that probably hundreds of thousands of people have died of hunger in Africa needlessly because they don't get access to the better technologies that they need, and nobody has died from consuming GMOs. So I'm a supporter of GMOs, and I just wish we could figure out a way politically to bring them on board and show that there are real benefits. Historically, there have been no benefits for the poor. It's been Roundup Ready corn and soybeans in the United States. Yeah, it helps the farmers, but it doesn't help the consumers. So consumers, even I live in the Sonoma Valley in Northern California, where they've tried now for the last 2 elections to ban GMO commodities in the county, just in the county. It hasn't passed because Big Food has really spent a lot of money preventing that. But I wish there were some way that people, even in where I live, could see that, yes, there are benefits. Yes, it's been abused. Is there some way we can solve that?
Thailand seems very proud of being or having food security.
Yeah.
Is it the right assumption for Thailand that it's the thing that we should be proud of?
I think any country that manages to achieve a broad social sense of food security, that is, people actually believe that the food is secure, that if they're in the cities, they can go to the market and buy it, and they don't have to worry. If they're farmers, they have enough land and technology that they can grow enough for their family, and they trust that. That sense of food security is absolutely essential to the economic development process. There's not one country in the whole history of the world that has been able to sustain high standards of living without food security, without that sense among the population that food is secure. And the reason is really simple. If you don't believe you have the food, you can't think about the future very far. You can't make investments that only pay off 10 or 15 years out. You're speculating, you're hoarding, you're sitting, it changes your whole mentality about how you relate to the economy, and food insecurity is terribly damaging to the economic growth process.
And what should the country do more in order to preserve or to maintain food security position?
Well, I think there's 2 different dimensions that are really important, not just in Thailand, but especially here. You've pretty much solved the availability dimension of food security. But the other major dimension is access. Do poor households have enough money? Do they have enough land in order to have access to good, nutritious food? Enough. And there, Thailand has quite a good record, but not perfect. I mean, you have a number of households that do not get enough food in quantity, and you have a lot of households that are malnourished, that just not getting the right amount, don't get enough iron, they don't get enough vitamin A, don't get the right vitamins and minerals, maybe not even the quality of protein that would be needed. So there are still some very significant nutritional problems in Thailand that are easy to solve when you have enough food, but you still have to address, you have to have a policy, you have to have interventions, because most people don't know about what's called hidden malnutrition. They don't know that they're not getting enough iron or enough vitamin A. So there's a knowledge dimension to that, but there's a public health dimension, and even doing fortified food can be very important in terms of making sure that everybody gets enough of the key micronutrients as well as calories and fat and protein.
Your research seems to suggest that it's also very important to study climate change to ensure food security or food supply.
Climate change is the big challenge going forward. I'm no specialist in climate change, but I have some very close colleagues, especially at Stanford University, who are real experts in this and look at the models that play out what they think is going to happen with the climate and interface that with our agriculture models. And so looking at, okay, what's the impact going to be on agriculture in different regions of the world by different scenarios of climate change. And it's scary. It's just plain scary. And it's scary because, as best we can tell, we're already seeing the impact of warming, of global warming. David Lobel at Stanford has done just a fascinating article in Science magazine a year or two ago, where he shows yields for wheat in Europe are 10% lower now because of higher temperatures than they would have been otherwise. Now they're still a little bit higher because we've had technical change and farmers are getting more efficient. But the point is, we've lost 10% of our productivity because of climate change already. It's a lot. That's a lot. I mean, it's really a big deal if you can increase yields 1 or 2% per year. If you lose 10%, that's cost you 5 or 6, 7 years of growth.
Is the world moving on the right direction? Because the Paris Agreement, the world leaders agree not to raise temperature more than 1.5 Celsius degree. Is it enough?
Well, if we can get that, we should be very happy. There was not much talk about agriculture at Paris. There's some on deforestation and the need to, sequester carbon in the soils and in the forests. But I think the big problem, if we can do what the Paris Agreement said, and look, I think most of us did not think we were going to get that agreement. We're pretty skeptical. It's clearly a step in the right direction. Lots of problems getting it implemented, of course, but you can't worry about implementation until you have the agreement in the first place. So I think it's a pretty big deal. I really do. I hope now that people will step back and say, oh, where does agriculture fit in this? Let's do, in a sense, a second round of discussions off the main political platform where we really try to figure out, okay, what are the implications for agriculture? How can it contribute to bringing carbon out of the atmosphere? Because sequestering carbon in the soil, we could reduce atmospheric CO2 levels by 100 parts per million. They're now 400. They're trying to get them back to 350. But if we did really carbon-intensive agriculture, that is, putting carbon in the soil, doing the cropping systems that regenerate the health of the soil, doing the reforestation. But agriculture and forestry combined could lower atmospheric CO2 levels by 100 parts per million over the next 20 years. That would solve the problem. So we need to start thinking about where agriculture is going to fit. Most of the discussion of agriculture in the last couple of years has been, oh, agriculture is a big contributor. I mean, we cut down the forests, cattle have methane gas, rice paddies release methane to the atmosphere, and methane is just as much worse greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. And so there's been a lot of talk about, well, agriculture is part of the problem. Now, actually, we have to start thinking about agriculture as being part of the solution. And it's going to take a slightly different approach to agriculture. You can't just mine the soil and dump fertilizer on. You're going to have to really worry about the health of the soil. You're going to have to worry about how much carbon content is in there.
Does it go together between getting agriculture right in terms of policy and stimulate economic growth? Do these two things have to go together?
I think they have to go together. They're simultaneous. I get in trouble with my econometrically oriented colleagues by claiming that agriculture causes the rest of the economy to grow more rapidly. I think the evidence is very clear that it does, but it's also very clear that the rest of the economy stimulates agriculture. You can't have a dynamic agriculture unless you have a dynamic non-agriculture. The cities have to absorb all the food that you're growing. So it's a two-way thing. It's simultaneous, but you have to do both.
But it seems the world is moving on to industrial production, to service sector, and agriculture seems to be left behind.
Well, I wrote a monograph called A World Without Agriculture, the structural transformation in historical perspective. And it points out that every single country that has sustained this pathway out of poverty did it by making agriculture more productive, but a much, much smaller share of the economy. In the United States, which has, I think, a pretty successful agriculture, we have more lawyers than we have farmers. We have more dry cleaner establishments than there are farms. So at one level you'd say, well, agriculture is just totally irrelevant to the U.S. economy. And in some sense, that's right. But in another sense, it's completely wrong. Because if you don't have the food, if you don't have the productivity, then you don't have the food security and you lose it.
What does the world should do more? What should the world do more in terms of end poverty and hunger by 20 and 30?
Oh, boy. Well, first of all, I think the UN adopted the Sustainable Development Goals in October, and that's where end hunger, end poverty by 2030. That's been agreed to now by 181 countries. There's a level of political commitment there that is at least as strong as the climate change commitment that came in Paris. So I think that has to be the good news, that there's really serious political attention to doing this. The UN thinks it's possible. Bill Gates, who has enormous influence in this arena because the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is the biggest external funder of agricultural research and good policy.
And you are advisor of the foundation.
I've retired from that now. One of my former students had been the head of the agricultural development. She's just retired, and so I thought that's a good time to step back. But I helped right from the beginning when the foundation was thinking about doing agriculture. I wrote the background paper for that. And it made the case that we've been talking about today, made the case that agriculture is the key to poverty reduction. You simply have to get your agricultural economy going, and you have to figure out how to achieve food security. It doesn't have to be self-sufficiency. I really don't want people to think all countries have to grow all of their own food. You have to have an efficient food system and an active trading system so that you can rely on the supplies coming from the most efficient sources. Thailand's the most efficient source, but that's you still have to be able to do that.
For ASEAN community, because we are approaching ASEAN community in 2015, by the end of this year. Does it mean to have increasing trade volume between or among ASEAN countries will also support food policy?
Yeah. This is a big challenge because a lot of the countries, Philippines and Indonesia, Malaysia, are very concerned about the AEC, the ASEAN Economic Community, threatening their agricultural sectors because you've got Vietnam, Cambodia, Myanmar, and Thailand being very efficient, not just in rice, but right across the board. And so a free trade zone for the ASEAN community would be a serious threat to rice farmers in those countries, especially Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines. Those are high cost. Now, the hope has, and it's very clear, they've gotten waivers, at least on rice. But I think this opening is going to, over the next decade, is going to make the whole ASEAN community more efficient. I'm hoping sanity will prevail in the importing countries, and they'll realize, wow, they're making their farmers poor by forcing them to grow rice. Why don't you let them grow chickens or do aquaculture or fruits and vegetables where the payoff per hectare and per farm is so much higher? Why not encourage that and let the farmers who are very efficient at rice produce that? It's still in the region. It's still secure.
Trade pact like TPP is now being discussed a lot and being watched very closely by the whole world. How do you think TPP will have effect on food security, on food supply at the global scale?
I don't think it's going to affect food security very much. It may well affect investment patterns in other industries, but it doesn't have very much impact on agriculture. I mean, I was interviewed on national public radio in the U.S. asking about rice and Japan, and it turns out the United States just blinked and said, "Oh, it's okay. You'll do a little bit at the margin to allow more rice in, but you get to keep your rice policy in Japan." I don't think TPP is going to affect agriculture very much because agriculture is simply too sensitive politically in these countries. So, we almost lost it on dairy imports to Canada because New Zealand was upset, and even there we didn't get very much into the TPP framework.
Why do you have so much passion in food policy?
That is, I've been asked that question before. It's really important. I mean, I've worked for 40 years, a little more than that now, in this field, and I have never had a single day when I doubted that I was doing the right thing. I've never had any of that self-doubt about my career.
Are you from agricultural family?
I grew up on a farm. It was actually, I won't even call it a farming family. We had a small tomato canning factory, and we had enough land to grow the tomatoes for our canning factory. So I went back and forth. I started when I was 8 years old cultivating and planting tomatoes. I have planted 10 million tomato plants. That's a lot. But I don't think it's the farm that is the passion. I think the passion comes from starting my work in Indonesia. Even in graduate school, I'm an economic historian. I've never studied development. I'm not a development economist. I'm an economic historian by training. And looking at the role of agriculture in the development of England and France, Germany, Japan, looking at that development and how critical agriculture was to industrialization. Yes, industrialization is what eventually pulls people out of poverty, but agriculture has to support that, and in a number of instances, agriculture leads that process. Well, think about pulling people out of poverty through agriculture.
Thank you, Professor Peter Timmer, for joining me.
My pleasure.
สวัสดีค่ะ วิสัยทัศน์จากศาสตราจารย์ปีเตอร์ทิมเมอร์นะคะเรื่องของความมั่นคงทางอาหารประเทศไทยอาจารย์ระบุว่ายังมีความมั่นคงทางอาหาร แต่เรื่องของการดำเนินนโยบายเพื่อที่จะทำให้มั่นใจว่าประเทศไทยยังเสริมศักยภาพในด้านนี้เป็นเรื่องสำคัญนะคะรวมถึงการเดินหน้าเข้าสู่ประชาคมอาเซียนที่จะต้องเพิ่มการค้าระหว่างกันในเรื่องของการเกษตรกรรมและผลิตผลทางการเกษตรเพื่อที่จะทำให้มีศักยภาพสูงสุดในระดับภูมิภาคค่ะทั้งหมดคือตอบโจทย์และที่นี่ไทย PBS สำหรับคืนนี้ค่ะดิฉันณัฐฐา โกมลวาทินสวัสดีค่ะ